Hello, everyone. Mr. Efird here. Hope you guys are all doing well. We're going to do a video lesson today on Sumer, which is one of the first kingdoms in Mesopotamia. We did an overview of Mesopotamia yesterday, and so we're going to jump right into the kingdoms of Mesopotamia today. We'll cover Sumer today, and then we'll cover Acadia and Assyria and some of these other kingdoms leading up to the Empire of Persia over the next couple of days. But we have a lot to cover, so I'm going to get started. As we go through the notes, if you guys will please make sure that you fill in your note sheet underneath using that Cami tool that's linked on your Canvas page. I will also link a copy of the PowerPoint slides that we're going over today on your page as well, so that you can go back and look at that at your own convenience. If you need to stop the video, pause it, or go back, you can certainly do that as we do this. But let's get started. We're going to talk about Sumer. All right, so Sumer is the earliest known civilization in what is now southern Iraq. If you look for it on the map today, look for Iraq, and in the southern part of Iraq, that is where Sumer was located. It was on a flat plain, which made it really good for farming. You want flat land that's well irrigated for farming purposes. If your land is on too steep of an incline, your seeds will wash down into the river basin. But being on flat land makes it good farmland. It is bounded, which means that the borders of Mesopotamia are on the Tigris and the Euphrates River. Okay, so Mesopotamia, of course, being the land between those two rivers. The Greeks would call it Mesopotamia, which again, the Greek words actually mean between the water, between the rivers here. Okay. All right, so Mesopotamia, as we just said, means the land between the rivers. It is located in the eastern part of the Fertile Crescent. And we looked at the Fertile Crescent on the map yesterday and said that the Fertile Crescent is that arc-shaped piece of land between the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean Sea. It has access to fresh water through many rivers. It's good land for farming. This was a land where we see several early civilizations like Mesopotamia, Israel, and Phoenicia. And we're going to talk about those other civilizations a little bit later on. In the spring, the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers would flood. The mountain water that is melting snow would fill those rivers up. They would flood, and it would deposit all of this rich silt, that soil that is so good for growing crops on the banks of the river. And that meant that your farming season, your planting season could begin after the flooding in the spring. Mesopotamia has a hot, dry climate, which means that you can grow crops for much of the year. Again, there's no winter there. You have the abundance of water from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, so you can grow those crops throughout the year. There's not really a winter season in Mesopotamia. It is known as the cradle of civilization because this is where we get so many different ideas and inventions. Writing is formed here, which brings us into the historic period. We talked about how important that was yesterday in our introduction video. So Sumer gives us all of those things, and it is important, an important part of civilization as a beginning there. By the year 3000 BC, many cities had formed in southern Mesopotamia, and we're going to call this area, the region is known as Sumer, and that's where we get the title for this early kingdom. All right, so for Sumer, the land in Sumer is isolated. These city-states are isolated from one another by geography. There are mountain ranges and hills that separate one city-state from another. And so each one of these will develop independently, and they kind of will self-govern themselves. That's what you'll see in the next bullet point here. Each Sumerian city and the land around it became a separate city-state. They had their own leaders. They had their own temples for worship. They had their own laws and rules to follow. So each city-state kind of ran itself. They did their own thing. Sometimes these city-states went to war with each other. They would fight over resources, who had the best access to the river, who had the best farmland. They would fight over these things. And as a result of that, the city-states would build walls around their city-state for protection to make sure that these other city-states could not invade and take what was theirs. So as a form of protection, they all built walls and gates. Okay? The Sumerians believed in many gods. Now that's called polytheism, and we're going to see that as a common thread between many of the early civilizations. They believed in a lot of different gods and goddesses, and they believed that these gods and goddesses were in control of different natural Events that occurred, like the flooding of the river, or if there was a severe drought, they would attribute that to a god. If there was a major event like an earthquake, that was the fault of a god, or a god maybe had gotten mad at the people, and this had happened as a result. Gods could also be in charge of human things. When people went to war with each other, there was a god maybe who was provoking that to take place, or there were gods that were in charge of certain artistries like basket weaving. So the gods played a major role in the life of many Sumerians. And kind of tying in with that, in the very center of each city state, they built what was called a ziggurat. Now, this was the temple for the gods to inhabit and where the people went to worship. Now, the ziggurats were shaped like a mountain. It had several levels or tiers as it went up to the top. And it was built that way for a very particular reason. The people of Mesopotamia and of Sumer were originally people who lived in the mountains that were, for the most part, to the north of where Mesopotamia is located. And eventually they moved into this flat land because it was good for farming. But when they moved there, there was one critical aspect of where they had lived before that made them want to build these ziggurats. When they lived in the mountains, they believed that their gods would live up on top of the mountain, and that's where they would reside. So when they moved into the valleys, they didn't want their gods to stay behind. They wanted their gods to move into the city so that they could provide protection. So to get their gods to come into the city, they built a mountain for their god to live on. That's what the ziggurat was. And it ends up being a temple for the people to come and worship the many gods and goddesses that they attributed things to in these Sumerian city-states. Okay? All right, the priests and priestesses held a large amount of power in Sumer. They controlled much of the land. They influenced the decisions that were made. And at one point in time, we believe that they may have even ruled these Sumerian city-states and would have made the laws and would have governed over them. We know in later times that kings did that, and we have a monarchy, which is an area which is ruled by a king. Okay? In ancient Mesopotamia, only boys could do this, and only boys who were from high-standing, high-ranking families went to what was called the Iduba, which was the scribe school. This is where you would learn to read and write. And remember, we said yesterday that most people in ancient civilization could not read or write. They were illiterate. But there were people who needed to learn the language, and they needed to learn to write things down to preserve them for the kings and for the priests, for the most part. And those were your scribes. Now, only boys could do this, and again, only from very rich families could attend the Iduba or the scribe school. It was also called the tablet house because Mesopotamian writing, called cuneiform, was written on clay tablets and allowed to dry. And those clay tablets have been preserved. And so that's how we know about cuneiform and the writing of the Sumerian people. Ordinary people lived in mud brick houses, and they were relatively small houses. The rivers did provide a lot of mud, and that mud is a resource that could be used. So the Sumerians would take it and form that mud into bricks, allow those bricks to dry in the sun, and then you could build structures with them. All right, most people in Sumeria were farmers. That was a predominant job that most people have. But remember, we did talk about job specialization, and there are other jobs that people take in Sumer. You have artisans, which are basically craftsmen. They build things, they make items that are desirable, and then they can trade those items for other things. Other people in Sumer were merchants and traders, and they would travel back and forth to these other city-states, and they would trade goods. Mesopotamia could produce a lot of things here. You see here that they could make tools, they could make wheat, they grew barley. They had a lot of things that they could produce, but they didn't have everything. And there were certain things they had to trade for. Some of the things that they would trade that barley and grain and the tools that they would create for is they would trade for copper. They didn't have copper in Sumer. They would trade for tin, and they would trade for timber. Hey, and you have to think, in Mesopotamia, there are not a lot of trees. It's a very fertile land for growing crops, but there's not a lot of rainfall. In other words, it's kind of a desert area. Apart from the rivers and the silt that they provide, there's really not a lot of fertile soil. So trees are not something that you come across very frequently in this area. They would have to trade goods for lumber. And of course, they needed that lumber to be able to build their structures, to build their houses and things like that. Okay. All right, people in Sumer were divided into three social classes. You have your upper class, middle class, and your lower class. The upper class is made up of the king, of course, who's top notch. He's at the very top of that social pyramid. You have soldiers who are up there, your warriors, your priests, and government officials are all up in the top tier of society. They're in the upper class. The middle class is made up of farmers, artisans, merchants, and fishermen. So these are the people who provided the food for your civilization. They were the people who would trade goods. They were your everyday working person. And the large majority, the largest number of people in Mesopotamia were in that middle class. And then you have your low class. And the lower class is made up of enslaved people. Mesopotamia did have slaves. Now, most of these were either prisoners of war, so they had been captured in fighting between city states. They could have been a criminal, someone who had committed some crime and was made into a slave as a punishment, or it was someone who owed a debt. And this is something you'll see in a lot of ancient civilizations, that if I owe a debt to someone, then I might be sold into slavery, maybe not for my entire life, but for a period of time so that the debt could be paid off. And that was something that happened in many of these older civilizations. So that's your upper class, middle class, lower class. Slaves would typically work in the temple or on a farm, performing tasks either for the priest to run errands for them, to do things for them, or on the farm, they might be someone who would dig irrigation ditches or would harvest crops, but they would have jobs to do. Okay. In Sumer, men were typically the head of the household and were also usually the heads of government. They would be the ones who make the laws, and they kind of run the government in Sumer. But women did have more rights in Sumer than women did in most other places. For example, in Sumer, a woman could buy and sell property, which was not all that common with other civilizations. Women could also run businesses. So these were things that in Sumer were very different from other civilizations. Okay. Sumerians invented writing. Now, this is such a big deal. And again, we talked about it yesterday, but I'll emphasize it again today, that writing changed the game. That historically we now have evidence of things that occurred. We have written accounts. We know so much more information now that things are being written down. And the Sumerians are the very first one who give us the gift of writing. And they do that through what's called cuneiform. And we're going to talk about that cuneiform writing a little bit later on. Cuneiform simply means wedge shaped. Cune is like corner. It's like a wedge that comes together. And then form, of course, means the formation of something. So the formation of the letters is through wedges and triangles, basically. And you'll see an example of that in just a few minutes. Sumerians also invented the wagon wheel. And we talked about how important an invention the wheel was yesterday. So much so that after 5,000 years, we are still using the wheel in our society today, which is a cool thing. Here we go. All right, Sumerians invented the plow. This is a tool that makes farming so much easier because you can break up the soil to plant your crops. If you simply throwing your seed out on top of the hard soil, it's not going to grow. It's going to be eaten up by animals, by birds. But if you break up the soil, all of a sudden that seed can take root and it can grow into a full plant that can be harvested. Sumerians invented the sailboat. So that they could harvest the power of the wind to move up and down the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers as they traded, rather than simply having to use manpower and rowing with oars. The world's oldest story comes from Sumer. They gave us writing, but they also gave us the world's oldest story, which is called the Epic of Gilgamesh. All right, the Epic of Gilgamesh is a cool story. It's one of the world's first superhero stories. I'm a superhero fanboy. I love the Avengers and all the Marvel superheroes. But Gilgamesh was one of the first superheroes. And he and his friend, who was a guy by the name of Enkidu, went on all these adventures. They would fight against monsters. They were able to accomplish these immense tasks, and they're able to do these incredible things. But in the end, Enkidu gets sick and he dies. And Gilgamesh, who's a king, he's mourning for his friend. He's so sad about what happened. Gilgamesh decides to go on a quest, and he wants to learn how to become immortal. He wants to make it so that he will never die. He'll never face the same thing that Enkidu has faced. And he goes through this entire quest, and he ends up failing. He ends up not finding a way to become immortal. But he learns an important lesson in all of this, in that we have to make the most of the time that we have. And that as a king, Gilgamesh needs to make an impact here and now, because he doesn't have forever. He will one day die. And so the Epic of Gilgamesh tells us some important stories and has some important moral values in it as well. And you can still read the Epic of Gilgamesh today. In fact, if you look at the slideshow that I've given you, there's a link on this page that you can actually click and go see the Epic of Gilgamesh. You can read that story in its translation in English, which is a really cool thing. All right, here we go, guys. Sumerians give us so much more. When we look at math and science, it's amazing what these guys accomplished thousands of years ago. Sumerians developed many mathematical ideas. They used geometry, angles, and measurements so that they could measure their fields and they could set up their cities and make sure that buildings were all angled in the same way and that walls were straight when they built their structures. They had a number system that was based on the number 60, and this is really cool. Sumerian counting and the number system that they have give us the 60-minute hour. Okay, so our hour is 60 minutes long. We have a 60-second minute. So the minute's made up of 60 seconds. All of that comes from Sumer. The Sumerians also give us the 360-degree measurement of a circle. Okay, going around the outside of a circle, we measure at 360 degrees. That's also how we measure angles. Okay, when you look at a triangle, we measure it in degrees. That all comes from the Sumerians. In addition to that, Sumerians were also astronomers. That meant that they looked at the stars and the planets at night, and they would map those things out so that they would know the best times to plant their crops. They knew when to hold their religious ceremonies. They were able to give us a 12-month calendar, which we still use today, and it's based off of lunar cycles. So as you look at the moon going from full moon to new moon, half moon, the crescent moons, and they would look at those lunar cycles, and they could tell when a month began and ended, and they give us the 12-month year. Over time, though, Sumeria was weakened through fighting between the city-states. All the wars that went on between one city-state and another caused Sumer to become vulnerable to outside invasion and outside groups. And eventually a group called the Akkadians, who were from the northern part of Mesopotamia, invaded Sumer, and they took over. There was a king by the name of Sargon. We're going to call him Sargon the Great. Takes over Mesopotamia in the year 2340 BC. And he conquers everything. He completely takes over the land of Sumer, and he forms the world's first empire. An empire basically is many different lands, many different countries, or in our case, city-states, that are all under a single leader, and that's going to be Sargon the Great. Sargon's empire lasts for roughly 200 years before falling to the next set of invaders. And again, that's going to take us from one kingdom to the next empire to the next until we eventually get to Persia. Okay, here we go. We're going to move forward. All right, we have a map behind us, and you can see the layout of the city-states. And there are a bunch of them traveling kind of from the Persian Gulf up into the north. And we're going to talk about the geography of Sumer. The area which forms Sumer starts at the Persian Gulf, which is down here, okay? And then it works its way north to what's called the neck of Mesopotamia. This is where the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, will actually come closer together. They meander closer together, as your text says here. To the east, you have the Zagros Mountains, where the city-states become a little more scattered. They're spread out because the mountains will provide that geographical barrier between them, okay? These city-states thrived on trade, and they learned from Sumer. To the west was the expanse of the Arabian Desert, and that was uninhabitable land. It's too hot and too dry for anyone to live there. But you can see the city-states starting with all the way here in the south and Eridu, and you make your way north to Rapiquin and Ishuna. All these city-states in between all trade with one another, and they form the basis of Sumer. Okay. All right, here we go, guys. Over time, the landscape has changed. The geography of Sumer has changed. The rivers have changed course considerably in the last 4,000 years or so. They've moved away from some of the cities where they originally flowed by. And there's a complex network of canals that would connect the river to the farmland so that they could irrigate their crops and provide water from their crops. Most of those canals have dried up. But at the time, the two rivers had separate entrances into, it calls this the foreshortened Gulf, talking about the Persian Gulf there, okay? Some of the earliest cities, such as Sippar, Borsippa, Kish in the north, and Uruk, and Eridu in the south formed the endpoints of what became a complex network of cities and canals. Girsu and Nippur were the most important religious centers in all of the land of Sumer. Then we have other cities like Larsa, Ishuna, Babylon, and Ezen, which really didn't emerge until the end of the Sumerian civilization. We're going to talk about especially Babylon rising up and becoming a very important player as we move forward between these different kingdoms and empires. But they become important kind of around 2000 BC. That word circa means around that time period. All right, so some of the major cities, we're going to go through our 8 features of civilization here. We'll see if Sumer matches up with those and if we can identify 8 features. Does Sumer have major cities? The answer is yes. You have the cities of Babylon, Eridu, and you can go on and name several more. But all of these are major cities in the kingdom of Sumer. Does Sumer have organized government? Absolutely they do. They have a monarchy. Sumer is ruled by kings, so we can say that it has a form of government. Do Sumerians have different jobs? Is there job specialization here? Yes, there is. We can look at farmers, merchants, priests, artisans, scribes. All of these people have different job specifications, and they all can perform their specialized duties. All right, is there a social class system? Absolutely there is. We talked about upper, middle, and lower class, with the upper class being the kings, priests, and warriors, middle class being farmers, artisans, and fishermen, lower class being your slaves, the people who have been enslaved. All right, is there arts and architecture? Absolutely there is. You have ziggurats. Mesopotamians built statues. You can see an example of that here. They had palaces for their kings. They had homes. They had poems that were written, like the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's a form of artistry. They had pottery, which was unique to this region. So arts and architecture, we can check it off the list. They definitely had it. All right, complex religion. Yes, we know that the Sumerians were polytheistic. They believed in many gods and goddesses, and they believed that these gods and goddesses controlled things that happen in nature. All right, as far as public works is concerned, did the government build things using tax money for the people? The answer is yes. We have ziggurats. They constructed roads. They built irrigation systems to the farmland. They dug these canals from the river so that you could bring river water into the farmland and make sure that your crops were going to grow. They built the idubas, those schools for the scribes, for wealthy boys to attend to learn how to read and write. All of those paid for through public works. They're government projects. All right, and we have writing. We know that the Sumerians gave us writing. They were the very first ones to create it. We know that cuneiform was the form of writing that the Sumerians used. It is a wedge-shaped writing. You can see an example of that with the clay tablet that's here. If you look closely, there are a lot of little triangle shapes, wedge shapes that are put together to form the cuneiform language. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the first story, the first epic poem that we have recorded in history. And of course, that comes from Sumer. We know that they wrote on clay tablets, and that's how they preserve their writing for us moving into the future. So all of these things, we can check it off the list and say, absolutely, Sumer meets that as one of the 8 features of civilization. All right, folks, that's it. We have covered Sumer. I hope that you have learned something from the video. I know we went through a lot of this information really quickly, but it's important for us to know. And of course, we've got those notes that we're taking underneath this. So if you need to go back and watch it. I will also share the PowerPoint slide with you so that you can go back and look at that on your own time and check and make sure that you have filled in your notes correctly. Enjoyed getting to hang out with you guys today. We'll look forward to covering Acadia next. We'll have another video on that and another set of notes coming up. But until then, you guys have a wonderful day. We'll talk to you later.